Are you rolling? My name is Christina Swift, and I was born October 3rd, 1954, and I was born in Manhattan, New York City, born in the apartment that I was raised in. And there were two midwives present, and my father was there too. And I had the birth went pretty well. And my mother bathed me in a basin of olive oil right after I was born. There was some spiritual significance about that for her, which I don't remember. And I was raised in Manhattan in an Irish Catholic neighborhood, and at that time there wasn't a melting pot. There were very clear-cut neighborhoods. You had the Irish Catholic neighborhood, you had Germantown, you had Little Italy, what they then called Chinatown. And immigrants tended to stay in certain pockets with their own families and friends. And so it was a wonderful experience to go to these different areas food-wise. And there was also, my mother took us, my brother and I, to a ceremony in Little Italy every year, which was called San Gennaro, and it was held at night. And there were all these beautiful lanterns going through the street, and wonderful food. And that was a highlight of my childhood. So I have a brother that's 4 years older than me, and his name is Daniel. And he's a medical doctor, and we grew up together. My father was with us till I was about 6 years old, and then he missed his homeland and he wanted to go back to Vienna, and his mother was over there and all of his relatives and friends, and he wanted us to come along, but my mother chose to stay in Manhattan at that point. So that's when the family broke up. But here's a photograph of my mother and father when they were still together, and with my brother as a young child. Mother went to Juilliard, and she had some interesting stories. There's a composer named Liszt, and a classical composer, and she was friends with his brother, and his brother had lost a hand in the war. And when she gave a party at her house one time, Liszt's brother was there, and Liszt had written a one-handed piano concerto for his brother, and his brother played that at this gathering that my mother had. That was before I was born. And when she was still at Juilliard, there was a very famous opera singer who needed a pianist accompanist. And at that point, there was not a situation where a woman would have been chosen as an accompanist. It just wasn't done. And all the guys at Juilliard made fun of my mother for applying, and she just ignored them and went forward and performed, and she was the one chosen by this very famous opera singer to have her as the accompanist. And my father went to Columbia. He got his PhD in organic chemistry, and then he got a really good job working for Sylvania, doing research. And he was drafted at some point in there to go to the front lines of World War II. And he was someone who wasn't fit to be a soldier. I'm remembering 1964 was a really powerful year. That was the year that the Beatles came to Shea Stadium in New York. And it was also, I believe, the year of the World's Fair coming to New York. And that was a wonderful memory I had with my brother. We went to the World's Fair together alone. My mother gave us money. And the lines sometimes were so long that he arranged a scam with me that he would say he has to go find his mother so that people would let him ahead of them, and then I was to say I need to go find my brother. And so we would get far enough up in the line so we could actually get in to see a certain exhibit. And the GE exhibit outside had these beautiful fountains. It was nighttime, and just incredible lights with them. I remember being amazed by them. And we went to Tad's Steakhouse, and I just remember having a really wonderful time with him. For the first time in my life, I took my allowance and bought a record. And the record I bought was Meet the Beatles. And I was really excited about it. And my brother was following me because he was kind of interested to hear what it sounded like, although he had to pretend he wasn't. And I knocked at my grandmother's house. She was on the 2 floors down from us. And I was really excited, and I showed her the Meet the Beatles album, and she got really, really upset, and she wanted me to give her the album, and I refused to. And then she offered to pay me $10 if I would give it to her so that she could throw it away. And the record itself cost $4.99 or something like that, and we didn't have sales tax. So my brother whispered to me, "Come on, go for it. Then you could buy 2 Beatles records." And he whispered it so my grandma didn't hear. But I had my principles back then, and I wasn't going to let her take that precious thing from me for any amount of money. And so that was the first album I ever bought. And I remember my father came a number of times to visit us in New York, and then when I got older I visited him a number of times in Europe. And the one time I remember, we were in New Hampshire. Well, every summer we were in New Hampshire, my brother and I. And my father took me to the first and only movie he ever took me to, which was The Sound of Music, since that was something that took place in his country. And so that's a movie that means a lot to me. And when my granddaughter was little, I used to play, on my guitar I would play songs and from Sound of Music. And she'd be this tiny little baby sitting in one of these little seat things. And I had her on the table, and she wasn't old enough to talk, but I remember that when I would finish each song, she would go like this. And I was so amazed, because I didn't know she would even know. I don't know where she learned about clapping your hands. And then when she got older, we would sing the songs, and also my grandson too, when I would call them on the phone. I met my husband in my teens, and after we were together, we just stayed together all the time. And I remember the night that I conceived my daughter. There was a full moon, and I had this experience of a spirit descending into my area. And sure enough, right after that, I found out that I was pregnant, and my husband and I were both really happy about it. And so I had dropped out of, let's see, I think I made it through 10th grade. And after that, I had dropped out of high school. And I never got a GED, and I decided when my daughter was little that I wanted to go to the community college and start with my path through college. And I went to the counselor, and I said, look, I really want to be here, and I think that I can, I'd do the work well. And he said he would talk to the dean about it. And he went and talked to the dean, and the dean said no, to the counselor, no, she can't. She doesn't have a GED. She only finished 10th grade. So I made an appointment with the dean myself, and I went in there and I said, look, there's a lot of kids here that don't even want to be here. Their parents are just making them come here, and I really want to come here. Please give me a chance. So he said, okay, if you get a B or better for the 2 terms, because they have terms on the East Coast, not semesters, you're in. And that was actually a policy in New York State at the time, that what he said was accurate. So I started going to community college, and I got all A's, and I got 1 B, I think, in the first 2 terms. And then when I finished the 2 years there, I got accepted at University of Massachusetts in Amherst, Mass. And they have the wonderful 5-college arrangement, where if you're enrolled in any one program, you can have courses for free in any of the other colleges, and that included Smith College. And I was in a program at UMass where you design your own program. And at that time, I wanted to be a dance therapist. And so my mentor was, turned out, the person I was able to choose and who was okay with me too, was one of the famous DeMille family. They're big in theater. It was, I think, Agnes DeMille. It was either the sister or the daughter, I forget now. Backtracking a ways, I was remembering again 1964. I think that was around the year that the transistor radio came into play, and I was given that for a Christmas present. And so it was a little radio that I could hold to my ear. And I remember that was the most wonderful, wonderful thing that I had. And at that time, the Four Seasons and the Shirelles and Martha and the Vandellas and Johnny Angel and Soldier Boy were really popular. And I was just in heaven. And I don't eat candy as an adult, I haven't. But there was a little store in our building. It was such a huge building that I would go down there and buy candy and sit there and eat candy and chew gum. And there was one kind of gum that was the size of a baseball card, and then it would come with a number of baseball cards in it. And they're collector's items now, so I wish I had kept them. But that was something. My brother wasn't all that interested in me because he was so much older, but that would always bring him over to me to see which baseball cards I got. And and then also, just sitting on the stoop there, there were always tons of friends that would be milling around because the building was so huge. And a lot of them were second generation. There were a lot of immigrants there from Ireland with the Irish brogue, and they would come over to where I was sitting, and then there would be some game that would emerge, and usually it would be, we made these jump ropes for Chinese jump rope and for Dutch jump rope out of rubber bands, and we put them together, and so they were a series of rubber bands, and then maybe even 5 of them, and 2 people holding them and rotating them in different ways, or sometimes 3, and you had to jump through it, and then at the point where you got messed up, see if the next person got any further. And then when we got older, there was the limbo. There was a song called The Limbo, and we used to have 2 people holding a pole and then seeing who could go the lowest. You'd go backwards under the pole. And there was an Irish gang there. I used to watch the kinds of initiation rituals that they had were incredibly dangerous. But I never, like one, the boys had to go along this ledge, and if they fell over, they would end up on cement, or on some bricks way below, like a whole floor, or a whole story below. And I never saw anyone fall, but they used to do things like after getting their knuckles bashed by the nuns at the Catholic school with a ruler, they'd come out and just wreak havoc all over the place. They'd rip up park benches, and I think they killed an older lady up in the park with stones. And but sometimes some of us girls, we would go with them when they would. They liked to go down to the pet cemetery, and climb over at night, climb over this very difficult fence and, see, I don't know why they like to do that, but we would follow them down there. And one time we went down there and went over the fence, and the caretaker came out, and the girls, we were just so afraid we didn't want to go back anymore after that. But I was never ever hurt by the Irish gangs. They never did anything to hurt me. But I married an Irish Catholic man. That's who I ended up marrying and having my only child with. And yeah, my only child, that's her. She was playing cards with someone. You can see they have a hand there that they're playing. And she's obviously winning. So she's in a really good mood. This was her a couple days ago on Easter Sunday. Here, my little grandson. And my beautiful granddaughter. Here. My daughter's been married for over a decade, and both the children are their children from the two of them. And that's my daughter and her husband. This is a photograph of myself before I went to school. And it was around this age. My dad was still with us. And I really wanted to go to school because my brother went to school. And I didn't know how you got into school. I thought maybe it's having a lunch sack. So my mother had made a meatloaf sandwich for my brother to take to school. And I asked her if she would make me a sandwich, and she did. And I found a little brown bag, and I put it in there. And I walked by myself all the way down to the Catholic school and sat on the bench waiting, because I thought maybe that's how you get into school. And my dad shadowed me, because it wasn't safe for a child that age in any neighborhood in Manhattan to just go waltzing off by themselves. And he just found it extremely funny and sweet. And there I was sitting there in the cold with my coat on and my little. Then I finally heard a bell ring, and I took my lunch out, and I think it was still the morning time. But that was me. I'm from an aristocratic family on my father's side. I was born a countess, and but the regime that I don't know what you call it, the reign of, is more the right word, was already no longer. And so that's all there was about that. But my father's grandfather, so it's my father's mother's father, yes. He came from a large Catholic family in Salzburg, and after 13 they couldn't afford to send the kids to school anymore because it cost money to send them to school. So my grandmother's father left Salzburg at a very young age, and he went to Vienna, and he put himself through 2 PhDs, and he shared an apartment with Hugo Wolf, who is a very famous operatic lyricist. And he then became city councilor of Vienna, and he had more than one term, I don't know how many, but he was friends with the Wittgensteins. They were a famous family in the field of philosophy and mathematics. And he married my grandmother's mother, and her name was Reimer. And that's the former name that I've used. And she lost her husband when he was fairly young. They have his portrait in the city hall in Vienna. My grandmother, my paternal grandmother, came from German Catholicism and French Catholicism. And she herself left the Catholic Church. And when my father was 6 years old, she went to study art at the Bauhaus under, most people had to take exams, and Paul Klee was the head of the Bauhaus at that time, Klee, that's Paul Klee. And he saw her artwork and he just said, "You're in." And she studied art with him. And my father went to a Catholic boarding school at age 6, and for him it was very traumatic to be away from his mother at such a young age, and he's talked about it on numerous occasions as an adult. And she has a website with her art. She's deceased now, but her name is Trude Wehner, Wehner, and I think it's .org, not .com. And let's see, what else can I say? My father was born in the Belvedere Palace in Vienna. It was not, now it's been revamped and it's very, very well kept up, and they have an art museum in it. But at the time, he showed me, he asked the guard if he could, that he grew up over there, and could he take me past where they had, you know, those ropes, they roped it off with velvet ropes. And the guard said fine, and he went and showed me that those were the stairs that he went down as a child, and that was his bedroom window. And he said that they stored the food on the ground floor, and sometimes there'd be rats running around there. So it wasn't that it was it wasn't like a palace when they lived there. But because of their aristocratic background, their family had quarters there. My grandmother took my father and left during the war. When I guess it was after the Anschluss, after Kristallnacht, after the Nazis moved in from Germany to Austria, and they left, and they had difficulty getting out of Europe, and they finally got out from England and moved to New York. And then my grandmother went back to Europe after the war, and My mother had a very expensive lineage tracing done, and she came from a Catholic family in a very small town that was part of Germany, and the family left Catholicism because they were not supportive of the priest at that time in that small town. And my mother's father lectured at a lot on Protestant Christianity, and my mother had study groups in her home on Christianity from the whole time I was growing up. And she had the Christianity that she taught in her home was very eclectic. It was primarily Christian, but it included some of the very esoteric writings from many different religions, including obscure ones. And so that's something that I still have, is an interest in comparative religion. And I've read the Bhagavad Gita twice, and I've read the Buddhist writings, and I still have to read the Quran. I've only read parts of it that looked very beautiful. And so on Sundays when I was growing up in Manhattan, we went to a really lovely church that was very simple. And they had a Scottish minister there, and there was a separate service for the children. We didn't have Bible study, we just had a separate service. And the Scottish priest with his Scottish accent would come to each child and put the child's hand in his hands and said something like, the Lord will be with you when you seek him. And every child was then to say, I will seek him. And it was a very, very precious kind of service to me. And I just felt a kind of reverie about it. And my mother said that I had a kind of reverie when I would say the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, that I had this kind of, like I was saying a prayer. And she said that when I was younger saying it, I would say, I pledge allegiance, because I didn't know what the word was. I didn't know what allegiance was. And I didn't hear it right. But, I just remember, this song Edelweiss in The Sound of Music. We came to the Seattle area in 1975, and I had already started my career on the East Coast, but at that point I went on with my schooling till I got my master's degree, and I also was working at different positions in my field. I worked as a social worker initially, and then I worked as a therapist for a couple different agencies, and then I went on to run programs where I supervised field offices and supervised therapists, and I worked for King County was one of my positions, and then I decided to go into private practice, and I had 16 years working in private practice. And I had a house near Green Lake, and I had a beautiful studio that I actually had designed, and it did pretty well in the earthquake. It did a parallelogram about twice the worst earthquake we had, and then it went back and settled and nothing broke, so that was surprising to me because I am not an architect. But I had a lot of skylights, and my clients were always very happy and comfortable in the environment. And I spent a lot of time taking workshops in parent effectiveness training, leadership effectiveness training through the Dr. Thomas Gordon's methods, and also in transactional analysis. Those were the two things that I was very fond of. And I had my own therapist was a psychiatrist who was a psychoanalyst, and so I really appreciated that method because they just let you have whatever you want to say, and whatever feelings come up are okay, and they stay out of your material. At the very end they might make a remark or so. And he was someone who had studied with my step-grandmother, who was one of the founders of the Psychoanalytic Society in Seattle, and she had studied with the Freuds in their living room in Vienna. And so it was a nice kind of flow that he had studied with her, and then I was getting training. In psychoanalysis, the person has to go through 10 years of their own analysis before they can work with patients, which is very different than what we have now. Psychiatrists are basically trained in medication management, and they might take one course in counseling. So you're lucky if you find someone who's actually having good listening skills. When I was in graduate school, I was the only female graduate student, and my grades were summa cum laude, and I enjoyed that program very, very much. In 1990, the state came out with licensure in my field for the first time. They had, prior to that, just registration. And I was one of the first people who got licensure in the state as a mental health counselor. And at that time, and possibly still, it was the highest level that was awarded in this state. And so I had that when I began private practice. And okay, I don't know what to say here. Yeah, so actually I think I was in private practice before the licensure came out in this state. And I so much enjoyed working with my clients, and I had been accepted in an organization that's very hard to get into, and I was surprised I got in because I didn't have that much experience in private practice, and a lot of therapists who had a lot of experience applied and didn't get accepted. I was the youngest member of a group of therapists, and we had different things that we were doing. I was in charge of public relations for the group, PR, and tracking where different places where I advertised were helping the group get more clients. And that became a help for me personally when I went into private practice. And the group had 30 therapists in it, and we did have some consultation, and also we would read articles and discuss them, articles in our field. And so I enjoyed that group very much. And they were called the Women's Therapy Referral Service, and they had a wonderful system where a client paid, I think it was $80, and met with our coordinator, and she would assess what their issues were and their style and the type of person they were, and then refer clients to 3 different therapists, and they could see 3 of us for free for half an hour, and then decide who they felt most comfortable working with. So that worked very well for me, and I got clients who felt comfortable with me. And you could take you could span the flowers I planted, but I'd have to move my car. I love music, and I play the silver flute, classical and jazz, and I also play the guitar and sing. At one point I taught myself the first movement of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, and I've learned to improvise on the piano some, and it's something I am very much longing to have again, is a piano. One of my favorite books is a book called A Crock of Gold by James Stevens. He was an Irish poet who used to recite his poetry in pubs, standing on tables. And as far as I know, it's the only novel he wrote, but it was really delightful, and I'll always remember that book.